You think you could have survived ancient Sparta? Please, you wouldn't even survive breakfast. That is, if they gave you breakfast. Sparta wasn't a gym. It was a war machine, one that trained its own citizens like expendable weapons and tossed out the weak like bad fruit. This isn't the abs and glory fantasy Hollywood sold you. It was cold, cruel, and usually barefoot. From baby inspections to legalized murder games, we're diving into the real reason Sparta chewed up most of its own, and why you, dear viewer, wouldn't have lasted past sundown. They say childhood is supposed to be magical. In ancient Sparta, childhood was more like a horror boot camp designed by a war-obsessed government with trust issues. From the moment you were born, you weren't a person. You were a potential liability. That's how the Spartans saw you. See, they didn't just hope for strong children. They tested for them, literally. At birth, Spartan babies were examined by city elders. And if you didn't look healthy enough, if you seemed weak, sickly, or imperfect, you were discarded. No, really. They'd toss you off a cliff. Welcome to the world. The place was called Mount Taygetus, and it was where the unfit were abandoned. The logic? Sparta had no use for weakness. Resources were limited, and they had no interest in compassion when it could cost them survival. That cold efficiency wasn't a flaw, it was policy. So let's say you did pass the baby test. Congratulations, you're now allowed to live. Until age 7. That's when your childhood ended, and the real nightmare began. At 7 years old, Spartan boys were taken from their mothers and thrown into the agoge. It sounds like a training camp. It wasn't. It was a legally sanctioned trauma engine designed to beat out any softness you had left. No more hugs, no comfort, no parental love. Just pain, discipline, and survival. Every part of the agoge was engineered to test loyalty, brutality, and how well you could suffer without complaint. Because in Sparta, silence was strength, pain was pride, and crying? Yeah, that wasn't allowed. You could be starving, freezing, or bleeding out of your nose. Didn't matter. If you shed a tear, you'd be publicly humiliated, maybe even beaten by the older boys. Speaking of which, the older boys weren't just classmates. They were mentors. And in this context, mentorship meant ritualized bullying, forced obedience, and very uncomfortable dynamics that modern psychologists would have a field day with. But in Sparta, that was just the way things were. You were taught to steal. Not just allowed, encouraged. Because if you were clever enough to sneak food, you proved yourself resourceful. But if you got caught, that's where it got twisted. You weren't punished for stealing. You were punished for getting caught. The logic was that a true Spartan should be cunning, silent, and efficient. If you failed to steal successfully, you failed to act like a Spartan. Cue the public flogging. And it only got worse from there. There was no such thing as a soft landing in the agoge. You slept on straw. You bathed in cold rivers. You didn't get shoes. Ever. Winter? Too bad. Suck it up. They gave you 1 cloak per year, dyed red to hide the blood. Because, yes, you would be bleeding at some point, probably often. And that red cloak, it didn't just hide the mess. It made it clear. Pain wasn't just tolerated in Sparta. It was camouflaged. Every day was a test. Every hour, a potential punishment. If someone in your group failed, you all suffered. It was communal shame, a tactic to build group obedience and force internal policing. Your peers became both your brothers and your jailers. Trust was conditional. Safety was temporary. And remember, this is still childhood. You haven't even made it to the actual battlefield yet. But you have already seen friends collapse. You've probably passed out from hunger. You've learned how to keep secrets, and most disturbingly, you've likely learned how to hurt someone on purpose. Because violence wasn't just part of the curriculum, it was the curriculum. Sparring was brutal, punishments were public, and cruelty wasn't frowned upon, it was applauded. If you could humiliate a weaker student, that meant you understood dominance. If you could take a beating and stay standing, you were respected. If you could do both, you were Spartan material. And that's what this was all about, becoming Spartan material. You weren't training to be a citizen, you were training to be a weapon. By the end of the agoge, you were expected to have no emotional weaknesses, no fear of pain, no empathy for the vulnerable. Your body was lean, scarred, and underfed. Your mind? Conditioned to obey and endure. And the best part? If you made it through all that, you were still just a teenager. You hadn't even been allowed to think for yourself yet. That wasn't part of the deal. Even friendship was conditional. You were often paired with an older boy for guidance, a system the state used to control behavior and reinforce hierarchy. These mentorships blurred lines in disturbing ways, often blending authority, violence, and inappropriate loyalty into a single, lifelong bond. By the time you reached adolescence, you'd been trained to see weakness as a disease, not just in others, but in yourself. And if you spotted it, you learned to kill it, emotionally, socially, and eventually, physically. Because in the next stage of Spartan life, death wasn't just something that happened in war. It was something you were trained to bring. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, you've survived childhood, which in ancient Sparta was about as rare as a day off. No cartoons, no bedtime stories, no soft pillows, just frostbite, fistfights, and fear of failure. If you made it to age 14, the state considered you a success. You were still alive, still standing, but you weren't a child anymore. Not even close. By the time you hit your teens in ancient Sparta, you'd already survived more abuse than most modern action heroes. But the Spartans weren't interested in resilience alone. They wanted loyalty, lethality, and obedience to the grave. Childhood was just the audition. What came next was the real transformation, from wounded boy to state-owned weapon. And let's be clear, they weren't molding you into a well-rounded adult. They were stripping away anything human that got in the way of war. The agoge didn't stop when you hit puberty. It just changed tactics. You'd endured public beatings before, but now you'd be expected to inflict them. The violence became more precise, more ritualized, less about survival and more about performance. Fighting wasn't just about winning. It was about how cleanly you could dominate someone, how brutally you could outlast pain. Humiliation of the weak became entertainment. If someone broke down, you watched, you didn't help, you learned. This stage of Spartan life came with mentorships that were complicated. Older males were assigned to younger ones as guides. In theory, it was to teach discipline. In reality, the relationships were often coercive, blurring the lines between authority and exploitation. These bonds weren't accidental. They were enforced by the system. Loyalty was manufactured. Intimacy, even the twisted kind, made it easier to obey without question. Love was conditional. Trust was taught in terms of hierarchy. You were always beneath someone. At around age 12 to 14, you were introduced to the concept of the krypteia, Sparta's version of a secret police, except with fewer secrets and more knives. The purpose of the krypteia? To terrorize the enslaved population, the helots. You'd sneak into villages at night and kill the strongest helots to keep them weak, afraid, and disorganized. This wasn't wartime. This was ritualized murder. And it was your final exam. Pass, and you were no longer just a trainee. You were a predator. The helots, for context, made up the majority of the population. They were the enslaved underclass who farmed the land, fed the city, and were treated like pests to be culled. Sparta needed them, but refused to see them as human. So once a year, Sparta would declare war on them, just so killing them wouldn't break any laws. Yes, Sparta created a legal loophole just to let their teenagers commit state-sanctioned murder. If that feels unhinged, it's because it was. Participation in the Cryptia was supposed to be the pinnacle of stealth and discipline. You weren't just learning how to kill. You were learning how to disappear, to suppress, to become emotionless while doing it. You were taught to see hesitation as betrayal. If you blinked, you failed. If you hesitated, you were weak. And if you were weak, well, Sparta had no room for weakness. So you smiled through pain, you laughed through fear, and you never, ever cried. Discipline wasn't just expected. It was enforced by your peers. If someone in your cohort slipped up, said the wrong thing, missed a step, showed fear, you all got punished. Group floggings, food deprivation, public shaming. These weren't punishments, they were reinforcements. You didn't just obey for your own sake. You obeyed to avoid dragging everyone else down with you. This meant you became hyper-vigilant. You watched your tone, you corrected others, you internalized the system. And that's how Sparta got you to police yourself. This was also when Spartans perfected the art of silence. Known as laconic speech, the ideal was to speak less and mean more. Long speeches were seen as indulgent. Quick, biting remarks were considered brilliant. The fewer words you used, the more dangerous you seemed. Sarcasm and wit became tools of intimidation. Even their humor was sharp-edged. Imagine living in a society where cracking a joke could get you praised, or punched, depending on the delivery. That was Spartan charm. Your days were spent training. Endurance drills, weapons practice, formation marching, hours upon hours of relentless repetition. You trained on empty stomachs. You trained with open wounds. You trained while frostbitten. The goal wasn't fitness, it was function. Could you still fight if you were injured, cold, or starving? If not, you weren't a real Spartan. You didn't get days off. You didn't ask for breaks. Your pain tolerance wasn't admired. It was assumed. The only time you weren't training was when you were fighting, or sleeping just enough to survive. And even sleep was a risk. Spartan boys were expected to sleep lightly, ready to defend themselves at any moment. Nightmares? Repressed. Fear? Suppressed. And if you had a crisis of conscience, if you ever started to question why you were doing this, who you were becoming, you buried it deep. Because questioning the system was failure, and failure was a fast way to get left behind. By now you were around 18. You'd spent more than a decade being broken down and rebuilt into something Sparta found useful. A human blade. You didn't speak unless needed. You didn't eat unless allowed. You didn't cry, flinch, or run. You were numb, hardened, efficient, and just in time, because war was coming. It always was in Sparta. And when it came, you wouldn't be given a grand speech. You'd be given a spear. And if you were lucky, you'd die holding it. Let's get one thing straight. When people imagine Spartans, they picture a chiseled warrior standing on a cliff with a six-pack and a sarcastic war cry. But the real Spartans? They didn't fight in slow motion. They didn't walk around with baby oil on their abs. And they sure as Hades weren't comfortable. Because comfort. That was for cowards. And nothing, absolutely nothing, was more dangerous to a Spartan than getting too comfortable. Which brings us to the cloak. The famous Spartan cloak wasn't just an accessory, it was a statement. Every boy in the agoge was given one red cloak, not two. Not one for summer and one for winter. Just one. No underwear, no spare socks, no shoes, and no exceptions. You could be freezing, soaked in rain, or sweating through a heat wave. You wore the same thing. The cloak was dyed red, not for style, but to hide the blood. Because, yes, you would be bleeding. The cloak didn't keep you warm. It didn't dry easily. It smelled awful after the second week, and you weren't allowed to clean it. You wore it like a second skin, even as it itched, stank, and stuck to your wounds. Why? Because if you couldn't handle your own discomfort, how would you handle the enemy? If you needed basic hygiene or warmth, what kind of soldier were you? Sparta didn't hand out medals for endurance. They expected it. Or else? Now let's talk about shoes, or more specifically, the total lack of them. Spartans didn't wear footwear. Not as kids, not as warriors, not ever. They trained barefoot in the heat of summer and the frost of winter. Across rocks, through thorns, on blood-slicked dirt. They believed that going barefoot made you tougher, gave you better balance, taught you pain tolerance, and again, comfort was weakness. Shoes were for the soft, for the civilized, for people who built cities instead of conquering them. Even sleep wasn't sacred. You didn't get a bed. You didn't even get a blanket. You slept on reeds or straw if you were lucky. Some nights you didn't sleep at all. Not because you were training or fighting, but because your body physically couldn't rest on the cold, uneven ground. And if you complained, you were laughed at or punished, probably both. In Sparta, misery wasn't something to avoid. It was something to embrace, because only the strong could ignore it. Hunger was another constant. Spartan meals were designed to be just enough to keep you alive and never enough to satisfy you. You know that black broth people talk about when they mention Spartan food? Yeah, that wasn't a myth. It was made from pig's blood, vinegar, salt, and meat scraps, whatever was available. It looked like sludge and tasted like iron-flavored regret. Visitors from other Greek states famously gagged at the smell. Spartans? They were expected to love it. And if you didn't love it, tough luck, because your other option was to steal. Remember, stealing wasn't discouraged. It was part of the curriculum. You were taught to sneak food, and if you succeeded, you ate. But if you got caught, you'd be punished, not for stealing, but for failing to do it properly. Some boys would even starve for days on end, too afraid of punishment to attempt theft. Others got creative. But no one was ever full. Even when you were injured, you didn't stop training. You didn't get crutches. You didn't get bandages. You just bled and kept moving. If your arm broke, you learned to fight with the other. If your foot split open, you limped through drills. Because in Sparta, you weren't training for the ideal scenario. You were training for the worst. And if you couldn't function while broken, then Sparta didn't need you. You were only as valuable as your pain threshold. Now picture this. You're 15. You haven't worn shoes in years. Your only clothing smells like blood and mildew. You've been starving for most of your adolescence. You've slept on straw, bathed in cold rivers, and fought dozens of your classmates in bare-knuckle brawls. And now you're being handed a shield and a spear. You're expected to stand in formation. You're expected to kill. And more importantly, you're expected to die if necessary without flinching. Welcome to the battlefield. Spartan warriors were trained in a formation called the phalanx, a tight, brutal wall of shields and spears that moved as one. It relied on unity, discipline, precision, and above all, trust. Not the emotional kind, though. This wasn't about friendship. It was about knowing the guy beside you wouldn't break formation, wouldn't flee, wouldn't hesitate. Because if one man ran, the wall broke. And if the wall broke, everyone died. That's what they drilled into you every day. But here's what people forget. The phalanx was claustrophobic. You couldn't swing wildly. You couldn't scream. You couldn't even see much. Just the backs of your comrades' heads and the glint of incoming spears. Your life depended on your shield. Not to protect you, mind you, but to protect the man on your left. That was the Spartan way. Self-preservation was selfish. Your body was already owned by the state. Your only job? Don't mess up the wall, even if it killed you. And yes, it often did. Spartans were raised to believe that dying in battle wasn't just honorable, it was preferable. Coming back alive wasn't the goal. You've probably heard the phrase, "Come back with your shield," or "on it." That wasn't poetic. It was literal. If you dropped your shield to flee, you were considered a disgrace. Your name was erased. Your family was humiliated. And if you did come back with your shield, wounded but standing, that was rare enough to be legendary. What made Spartan warfare even more brutal was the expectation that you never showed pain. You could be bleeding out. You could have an arrow in your leg. You could be moments from collapsing. And still, you were expected to fight silently. There are stories of Spartans who fought with broken bones, open wounds, and missing limbs. Some survived. Most didn't. But all of them were raised to treat pain like a mild inconvenience. Emotion? That was weakness. And weakness didn't survive long. Even the way Spartans talked about war was ruthless. They didn't glamorize it. They didn't soften it. If anything, they mocked it. Humor was their coping mechanism. Dry, grim sarcasm filled the gaps between horror. A Spartan once said, when told the Persian arrows would block the sun, "Then we'll fight in the shade." That wasn't just a quip. That was survival logic, Spartan style. When the sky darkened with death, they cracked a joke, and then they charged forward. But make no mistake, none of this was romantic. The cold, the hunger, the endless drills, the injuries that never healed right, the nightmares, the constant threat of death, the way your humanity got sanded down until you were more weapon than person. Spartans didn't live glorious lives. They lived short, brutal ones. Lives of discipline, violence, and fear disguised as pride. They weren't superheroes. They were survivors of a system designed to erase everything soft from the soul. And yet, many of them believed in it. Because when you're raised to worship war, it becomes your only language. When you're never shown gentleness, kindness feels like weakness. When pain is your only teacher, it starts to sound like truth. By the time you stood on that battlefield, barefoot and bleeding, you didn't ask why. You didn't wish for comfort. You didn't remember what warmth felt like. You just tightened your grip on your spear and waited for the order. If you were lucky, or maybe unlucky, you survived long enough to become a full Spartan citizen. But don't confuse that with freedom. You didn't graduate from Spartan life. You didn't get a diploma and a vacation. You didn't get to go off and find yourself in the countryside. You belonged to Sparta until your body gave out. The system didn't raise you to live. It raised you to serve. And that service ended only when you died, preferably in battle, with style. Around the age of 20, If you had made it through the agoge without collapsing, starving, or being discarded for weakness, you were considered eligible for full military service. But eligible didn't mean anything changed. You still lived in communal barracks. You still ate the same black broth. You still trained daily. And now you fought actual wars, real ones, with real blood and real consequences. You didn't get a salary. You didn't get glory. You got responsibility and constant scrutiny. Between 20 and 30, you weren't even allowed to live with your wife, assuming you were married. Yes, Spartan men could marry, but marriage was less about love and more about reproduction. You were expected to sneak out of the barracks, impregnate your wife, and sneak back before dawn. If you were caught spending too much time with her, it was frowned upon, because bonding distracted from duty. And Sparta didn't do distractions, not even the romantic kind. By age 30, you were finally granted full citizenship, a Spartan homoeos, or equal. But equality didn't mean retirement. It meant even more pressure. You were now expected to lead by example, enforce discipline, and remain battle-ready. You'd also be joining the Syssitia, Sparta's infamous dining clubs. Think of them like war veteran support groups with zero emotional support and a lot of judgmental stew. If you didn't bring your share of food, you didn't eat. If you missed too many meetings, you were expelled from society. And once expelled, you lost your rights. Spartan citizenship wasn't permanent. It was conditional. Conditional on loyalty, on contribution, on pain tolerance. If you failed to meet expectations, even once, you could be stripped of status. And that meant social death. You weren't invited to public events. No one spoke to you. Your children couldn't inherit your status. You became a warning, a ghost among the living. And worse, you were often mocked openly. That's the reward for not dying correctly in Sparta. Public shame. But let's say you were the model Spartan. Let's say you fought valiantly, trained daily, enforced the rules, raised warrior children, and stayed silent when it counted. What did you get? Maybe, a funeral with honors, because that was the only real reward. Dying with your shield intact, face toward the enemy. Anything else was disgrace. Even if you fought bravely but survived the wrong battle, people would whisper. Suspicion clung to survivors like smoke. Why didn't he die with the others? There's a reason Spartan mothers were known for telling their sons, "Come back with your shield," or "on it." It wasn't metaphor, it was policy. The shield was a symbol of the phalanx. Dropping it in retreat meant breaking formation, betraying your brothers, abandoning your duty. Better to die standing than return crawling. And if you did return without your shield, you were branded a coward. Your name was removed from records. You couldn't speak in public. You were a walking embarrassment. The Spartans even had rituals for disgracing cowards. At funerals, women would dance around their bodies in mockery. In the streets, children were taught to sing songs mocking their names. No one offered comfort. No one listened to your excuses. One man reportedly lived for decades wearing a literal sack, wandering alone, shunned by everyone, even his own family. Because the only thing worse than dying in Sparta was not dying when you were supposed to. Sparta's version of old age was, let's say, selective. If you lived past 60, you could retire from military service. But by that point, your body was usually too broken to enjoy anything. You didn't get a house in the hills or time with grandkids. You got to attend council meetings and occasionally yell at younger warriors for being soft. You were revered, sure, but mostly for surviving the system. Wisdom wasn't passed down gently. It was barked through broken teeth and scar tissue. For women, by the way, the stakes weren't much better. Spartan women were expected to birth strong warriors. That was their job, their pride, their purpose. If a woman died in childbirth, that was considered honorable, just like dying in battle, because, again, duty over everything. So no one was spared from the pressure. Men, women, children, even the elderly. Everyone existed to serve the Spartan state. And the moment you stopped being useful, you stopped mattering. And yet, Spartans were proud. They believed their way of life made them strong, made them pure, made them unconquerable. And in some ways, they were right. Their warriors were feared across the ancient world. Their discipline was unmatched. Their city remained unconquered for centuries. But the price of that dominance was steep. No joy, no softness, no room for weakness or love or personal freedom. You didn't live in Sparta. You endured it until you couldn't. The irony? For all their obsession with honor and death, most Spartans died anonymously. Their names lost to history, their bodies buried in mass graves, their sacrifices unrecorded. Because war doesn't keep receipts. And the Spartan system, for all its rigidity, eventually crumbled under its own weight. There were too few citizens, too much control, not enough humanity left to adapt. In the end, Sparta didn't fall to an enemy. It collapsed inward, crushed by the same pressure it had demanded from its people. So if you're still imagining yourself as a Spartan hero, shirtless, fearless, shouting into the abyss, ask yourself, would you survive a system that demanded your life in exchange for a name that might be erased anyway? Could you spend 60 years being told when to eat, when to fight, when to die? Would you choose to live a life where death wasn't the enemy, but the goal? If the answer's no, then congratulations. You're human. You weren't designed to be a weapon. You were designed to feel, to fail, to love and laugh and heal. But in Sparta, those were luxuries, and no Spartan ever retired into luxury. They retired into legend, or silence, or the dirt. That's not a warning. That's just history. And if you think you'd last a day in their sandals, just remember, they didn't even wear any. At this point, you've survived infanticide, the agoge, the crypteia, starvation, frostbite, and battles where the best-case scenario was dying quickly. Congrats. But here's the twist. Even if you managed to live through all that, you still wouldn't be free. Not in Sparta. Because there was no such thing as peace. Not for Spartans. The moment things got quiet, that's when you really had to worry. Because in Sparta, peace wasn't rest. It was a setup. See, Sparta wasn't a nation built on trust. It was built on paranoia. And that paranoia had a name. The Helots. The Helots were the enslaved class. Native to the land the Spartans had conquered, brutalized, and forced into labor. They farmed. They cooked. They did everything so Spartans didn't have to. And they outnumbered the Spartans by as many as 7-1. So Sparta lived in constant fear that one day the Helots would snap and take their revenge. Rather than grant rights or fair treatment, Sparta doubled down on terror. Every autumn, the ephors, Sparta's ruling magistrates, would officially declare war on the Helots. This wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal annual declaration of war against their own enslaved population. Why? Because it made murder legal. Teenagers in the crypteia could sneak into Helot villages and kill anyone deemed too strong or too confident. No trials, no oversight, just state-sponsored assassinations in the dead of night. This wasn't war. This was terror management. It was Sparta's way of keeping the helots afraid. Not just afraid of rebellion, but afraid of being noticed. If you were too healthy, too fit, too well-spoken, you were a target. Because that meant you could lead. And leaders posed a threat. So helots kept their heads down. They walked with slouched shoulders. They mumbled. They looked afraid. Because anything else could get them killed. And Spartans called this order. And this wasn't a hidden policy. Everyone knew. The helots knew they were being hunted. The Spartan teens knew they were learning how to kill without guilt. And the adult Spartans knew their entire society depended on this constant, suffocating fear. The silence of the helots wasn't peace. It was survival instinct. The quiet streets weren't signs of harmony. They were signs of oppression so deep it didn't need chains. And that's the system you were fighting to protect. Day in, day out. The craziest part? Spartans hated talking about the helots. They avoided mentioning them in writing. They didn't build statues or record victories over them. Because deep down, they knew. They knew the helots weren't foreign invaders. They were neighbors, people, families, and keeping them enslaved required not just violence, but self-deception. Sparta had to believe that helots were less than human. Because if they weren't, then the entire Spartan identity, its rituals, its pride, its glory, was built on a lie. This paranoia didn't stop with the helots. It bled into every aspect of Spartan life. Spartans distrusted outsiders. Trade was limited. Art was minimal. Foreign visitors were watched. Too many questions got you side-eyed. Too much intelligence got you labeled soft. Innovation? Suspicious. Curiosity? Dangerous. Individuality? Threatening. You didn't ask why. You asked how high when Sparta told you to jump, preferably into a war zone. Even among Spartans themselves, no one truly relaxed. Your every move was being judged. Miss a meal with your Sicilia group? Suspicious. Avoid eye contact with your superior. Arrogant. Seem a little too sentimental. Weak. You learned to flatten yourself, to stay in the middle, not stand out. Even praise was risky, because if you became too respected, someone might see you as a rival. And in Sparta, rivals had a way of disappearing. This deep distrust created a culture where surveillance wasn't just external, it was internal. You policed your own thoughts, your own emotions. You second-guessed every sentence, every gesture, every relationship. You had friends, sure, but not the kind you could collapse around. Not the kind who'd talk you off the edge, because there were no edges. There was only the line, the one you didn't cross, the one you didn't even look at too long. And all this, it made Sparta effective. For a while, they won wars. They struck fear. Their enemies called them beasts, machines, monsters in human form. And that's exactly how Sparta wanted it. But being feared isn't the same as being stable. You can't run a society forever on suppression, on fear, on silencing everyone until only war cries remain. Eventually, the silence gets too loud, and someone always breaks it. By the time Sparta started to decline, it wasn't because they lost a great war. It was because they ran out of people. The population of full Spartan citizens shrank dramatically. The system was too selective, too brutal, too demanding. There weren't enough boys surviving the agoge, not enough men to fill the phalanx, not enough soldiers to kill helots in the night. So they made exceptions, lowered standards. And just like that, the machine started to rust. They tried reforms, let some outsiders in, offered diluted citizenship. But it wasn't enough. The rigid system they'd worshipped couldn't handle flexibility. It shattered under its own weight. By the time Sparta fell behind other Greek states in trade, culture, and population growth, they had become a shadow of themselves. The people who once defined themselves by their toughness quietly vanished from history's main stage. So no, there was no peace in Sparta. Not for the enslaved, not for the soldiers, not even for the old men clinging to tradition like armor that no longer fit. There was only fear, wrapped in discipline, camouflaged in ritual, and beneath all of it, silence. The kind that isn't peaceful, the kind that's heavy, unnatural, the kind you only find in places where people have been trained not to scream. That's the world you would have walked into, barefoot and blind to the nightmare waiting just behind the walls. This wasn't the land of glory. This was the land of control. Survival wasn't proof of strength. It was proof that you hadn't been noticed, that you hadn't made the mistake of standing out, that you hadn't flinched when they handed you a knife and pointed you toward your neighbor's door. So let's go back to the original question. Why wouldn't you last a day in Sparta? Because it wasn't just the hunger, or the cold, or the blood. It was the fear, constant, low level, never ending. And if that didn't break you, the silence would. So no, you wouldn't last a day in ancient Sparta. Not because you're weak, because you're human. Sparta didn't reward humanity. It erased it. No joy, no softness, no peace, just obedience, violence, and the looming threat of disgrace. They didn't raise warriors. They forged weapons, and when the blade dulled, they tossed it aside. So the next time someone calls Spartan life hardcore, ask them if they'd like to train barefoot, sleep on straw, and kill their classmates for homework. Then watch them flinch. Exactly.